Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a truly captivating puzzle from, well, the late 19th century that still has scholars scratching their heads. It's the story of the Shapira Scroll.
Oh, yes. This supposed ancient Hebrew manuscript of Deuteronomy, it turned up in 1883, presented right to the British Museum.
And the atmosphere back then, it was just buzzing with excitement about biblical archaeology, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. You had discoveries like the Magistel really capturing the public imagination. So the idea that another, incredibly ancient text might surface, thrilling.
But also probably raised concerns about, well, fakes, authenticity.
Understandably, yes. And right in the middle of it all was Wilhelm Shapira. He was a Jerusalem antique dealer, converted Jew, quite successful.
Now, it's important to remember this wasn't his first time dealing with, let's say, controversial artifacts.
No, definitely not. He'd been involved with some Moabite pieces before, which Charles Clermont-Ganneau, a big name, a French scholar, had actually proved were forgeries.
So already there were maybe some question marks around Shapira when he showed up with this Deuteronomy scroll.
Exactly. And then there's the price tag.
Oh, yeah, the price, £1 million British pounds.
A staggering sum for the time. Enough to make anyone take notice, right? But maybe also a bit suspicious.
Definitely. Still, the British Museum, they were interested enough to investigate. They brought in Christian David Ginsburg.
A very respected biblical scholar, yes. He was tasked with evaluating it. But almost like fate, or maybe because of that history.
Clermont-Ganneau gets involved again, the same guy who exposed the earlier forgeries.
The very same. So you have these major players all converging on this one set of fragments. Is it this huge discovery or just a massive fraud?
And things moved incredibly fast, didn't they?
So fast. Despite that initial consideration, Clermont-Ganneau, well, he went public pretty quickly, declared it a forgery.
And Ginsburg followed suit.
He did, yeah. Echoed the forgery conclusion. And this just ignited a huge public scandal.
The outcome was just tragic. Within a year, Shapira died by suicide.
A really stark reminder of the pressure, the high stakes involved in all this.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we've looked at the records, the analysis, and our aim is really to revisit the evidence.
But with a new lens. Right, we can now look at it thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which nobody knew about back then.
Exactly. We want to understand why those 19th century scholars dismissed it so quickly. We'll focus on the physical stuff, the fragments themselves, and the writing, the paleography.
Okay, so let's start with those first reactions. Clermont-Ganneau's verdict came fast.
It really did. And it seems like it was mostly based on how it looked, the materials, not so much a deep dive into the text itself.
That's right. He wrote a letter, published it in the Times, basically said he thought the fragments were cut from the bottom edges of big synagogue scrolls.
Okay, what else?
He also felt the writing looked a lot like the Moabite stone script, which, given his past experience with Shapira.
Red flag for him, presumably.
Big time. And he also pointed out these vertical lines, hard point rulings on the leather that he said the scribe hadn't followed. Just ignored them.
And Ginsburg. He seemed a bit more cautious at first, didn't he? But then he ended up agreeing.
Yes, he cited similar reasons. These narrow strips of leather, again, supposedly from scroll margins. He mentioned those hard point rulings going beyond the text. And he noted something about the edges. Some top edges were straight, but the bottoms are ragged. He thought that meant they were freshly cut.
And chemical treatment.
Yeah, he even claimed he found evidence of chemicals, like it had been artificially aged within some kind of frame.
But the interesting twist is, just days before he condemned it, hadn't he published part of the text, treating it like it might be real?
He had, which is fascinating. It really suggests maybe things weren't quite so clear-cut even then, especially regarding that ruling point. When you look closer, even had his own drawings.
It casts some doubt on those initial forgery claims, especially now, knowing what we know.
Definitely. And you have to wonder about the pressure Ginsburg might have felt. There's mention of a letter from Edward Maun Thompson, the principal librarian at the British Museum.
Oh, right. Not Bond, then. Thompson.
Yes, Thompson. Apparently, he wrote to Ginsburg expressing his own doubts before Ginsburg even finished his report.
So maybe a bit of internal pressure there, a prevailing mood in the museum.
It certainly suggests that, yeah. And it wasn't just the British. There was a German committee, too.
Right. They looked at it as well. And their conclusion.
Forgery again. And remarkably quick, like an hour-and-a-half examination.
That's incredibly fast. Did they publish why?
No, that's the thing. No detailed reasoning published, so we're left guessing a bit. Maybe they were influenced by Clermont-Ganneau's public statements, the whole scandal unfolding.
Okay, so strong dismissals early on focused heavily on the physical side. Let's pivot now and re-examine those physical points, but thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Good idea. So, point one, the material. Leather. Big skepticism back then about leather lasting millennia in Palestine's climate.
Right. Scholars like Condor and Sayce were really doubtful. They thought the humidity would just destroy it. 3,000 years seemed impossible.
And yet, the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered decades later. What are most of them written on?
Leather.
Exactly, leather that survived over 2,000 years in those caves. As Cansdale points out, that discovery alone really undermines one of the core arguments against Shapira.
Okay, what about the edges? Ginsburg's point about straight tops and ragged bottoms on the Shapira fragments, suggesting a recent cut.
Well, again, we look at Qumran. Scrolls like 4Q Dutton, that's a Deuteronomy manuscript from Cave 4, or 11Q Pise, the Psalms scroll from Cave 11.
What do they show?
They show similar features, relatively straight tops, more ragged, deteriorated bottoms, so that look isn't automatically proof of forgery. It could just be, age and wear.
Interesting. Then there's the story of how it was found. Shapira said Bedouins found it in a cave near the Dead Sea.
Which sounds incredibly familiar now, doesn't it?
It really does. The first Dead Sea Scrolls found by Bedouin shepherds in a cave near the Dead Sea in the Qumran area.
Now, there were older stories. Eusebius mentions Origen finding manuscripts near Jericho.
But those were different, right? Greek texts found in jars, not wrapped near Jericho, not necessarily in a cave like Qumran.
Correct. The parallels between Shapira's story and the actual Dead Sea Scroll discovery are much closer. It's certainly striking.
And the wrapping. Shapira claimed it was wrapped in linen. That also drew skepticism.
Oh, huge skepticism. People thought it was illogical. Linen wouldn't last as long as leather. But guess what they found the Dead Sea Scrolls wrapped in?
Linen.
Linen, exactly. Taguay and Cansdale both highlight this. Key scrolls from Cave 1, the Great Isaiah Scroll, Habakkuk Commentary, Community Rule, all wrapped in linen. Some even coated with a dark stuff, probably for preservation.
Something a 19th century forger probably wouldn't know to include.
Very unlikely. It actually makes Shapira's account seem, more plausible in retrospect.
Okay, let's talk about the ruling on the leather. This was a big criticism from both Clermont-Ganneau and Ginsburg that the scribe ignored the vertical guidelines.
Right. This is a really crucial point, and maybe a bit misunderstood back then. If you look at Ginsburg's own drawing of a Shapira fragment,
The one in the British Library.
that's the one, he actually seems to show a difference between simple fold lines in the old leather and the actual vertical ruling lines meant to guide the scribe.
Ah, okay. So maybe the text didn't ignore the ruling lines, just crossed over some folds.
It looks that way. The text might slightly go over fold here and there, but it seems to respect the intended vertical boundaries pretty well. So that initial judgment might have been based on a misunderstanding.
And Hermann Guth, the German scholar who studied them more closely.
Guth noticed that too. He said, yeah, maybe a letter pokes out sometimes, but the overall line lengths are surprisingly uniform, which suggests the scribe was following some kind of boundary.
So Clermont-Ganneau might have mistaken folds for ignored rulings, and Ginsburg maybe didn't fully clarify it.
It seems possible, especially with the pressure mounting. And we now know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that it's quite common for vertical ruling lines to extend above or below the actual block of text.
What about horizontal lines? Did they see any?
Neither Ginsburg nor Clermont-Ganneau mentioned finding horizontal ruling. Now, maybe there wasn't any. Emmanuel Toff points out some Qumran scrolls lack horizontal ruling.
Maybe.
Or maybe the fragments were just too dark and fragile to see faint lines. Even Thompson's letter just mentions columns between ruled lines. Doesn't say anything about text crossing them. Suggests the vertical rules were likely okay.
Right. And that brings us to the darkness of the fragments. Ginsburg found them hard to read, right? Said it was surprisingly clever if it was a forgery.
Yes, and that blackened look. Also seen in some Dead Sea Scrolls, there are Paleo-Hebrew Genesis and Leviticus scrolls from Cave 6 described as trenorsi, very blackened.
So what causes that?
Well, it could be the ink they often used, iron gall ink, reacting with the leather over time. Plus, centuries in potentially damp caves. Calderaro suggested gallic acid degradation could play a role.
And there was something about wax.
Yeah, Flight's analysis suggested wax, not asphalt as initially thought. This could even point to attempts by the Bedouin finders to preserve the fragments, maybe similar to how some Dead Sea Scrolls were found treated or coated.
Okay, so looking back at all those physical points, the leather, the edges, the discovery story, the wrapping, the ruling, the dark color through the lens of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Suddenly, many of the reasons for calling it a forgery seem, much less certain They don't hold up quite as strongly.
Right. So now let's shift to the writing itself, the paleography. Ginsburg claimed the forger just copied the script from the Moabite stone, the Mesha.
But Hermann Guthi, again, he did a really detailed comparison. And he found at least 7 Hebrew letters that looked different on the Shapira fragments compared to the Mesha.
7 differences. That's quite a few.
It is. And he also found 3-letter shapes on the Shapira scroll that were completely unknown back then. Didn't match anything they'd seen before.
And Guth made a chart, right, showing these differences.
Yes, a paleographic table. And interestingly, some of the Shapira letters he drew, like Tet, Kaf, Kof, actually look quite similar to forms we later found in Dead Sea Scrolls, like 4Q Paleogen or 11Q Paleolef.
So not just a simple copy of the Mesha then?
Doesn't seem like it. Plus, as Emmanuel Toff stresses, the Paleo-Hebrew script in the Dead Sea Scrolls isn't monolithic. It varies between scribes, between texts. So Ginsburg's claim of a close imitation, Guthi's work really doesn't support it.
What about the letter Aleph specifically? There was some discussion about its form.
Right. They identified the LS on the Shapira scroll as the cursive pointed V shape, generally seen as an older form. The slightly more rounded kind of parallel line form became more common later, around the Dead Sea Scrolls era. But Guthi himself compared the Shapira Aleph to forms on Old Hebrew coins, which often have that later parallel form. And he compared it to the Siloam inscription Aleph, which is the parallel form, without saying the Shapira Aleph was a major anomaly.
So maybe the evolution wasn't so strict.
Seems that way. And crucially, scholars like Cross and Friedman, looking at the Dead Sea Scroll 11Q Paleolef, found both the earlier V form and the later parallel form of Aleph used in the same scroll.
Ah, so a scribe might use both, or different forms existed side by side.
Exactly. It muddies the water on using just the Aleph form as definitive proof of age or forgery for the Shapira scroll.
This brings us nicely to that specific Dead Sea Scroll you mentioned, 11Q Paleolef, the Leviticus scroll from Cave 11. That seems like a really key comparison.
It really is. The parallels are striking. Both contain Torah text, both written in Paleo-Hebrew script.
And both seeming to imitate an older style.
Yes, an archaic style. Plus, if it's a pattern, most of the Paleo-Hebrew biblical texts found at Qumran are from the Torah or Job. The Shapira scroll fits right in.
What about the physical material?
Also similar. Both on-tanned leather. Both show a range of colors in the fragments, from light to dark brown. Even the height of the surviving pieces is comparable.
So Clermont-Ganneau's idea of narrow strips cut from margins, how does that compare?
Well, the 11Q Paleolef fragments challenge that. And remember that Daily News reporter back in 1883, they described the Shapira leather as feeling thicker than usual synagogue scrolls, not like thin margins.
Any other visual similarities?
Yes, actually. The fragments of 11Q Paleolef, when unrolled, show a slight arc shape. And if you look again at Ginsburg's drawing of a Shapira fragment,
it shows a similar curve.
It does. It's not the perfectly straight strip Clermont-Ganneau imagined being sliced off a margin. Yeah. It's just something perhaps rolled up tightly for a long time.
Fascinating. Now, we should also bring in Shapira's own views, shouldn't we? He wasn't just the seller. He analyzed the text, too.
He did. He actually pointed out things he saw as mistakes or deviations from the standard Masoretic Hebrew text. His argument was basically, why would a forger introduce errors? Wouldn't they aim for a perfect copy?
That's a fair point. Trying to create something too perfect might be the forger's trap, but deliberately adding deviations seems risky.
Very risky, especially given the sheer number of fragments, lots of text, lots of opportunity for a slip-up to be caught if it was fake. And Shapira knew his stuff.
Yeah, he helped decipher the Siloam inscription, right?
He did. Made some very insightful contributions there. His letters about the scroll discovery, like the one to Strack, and the immediate, really harsh rejection by Schlottmann, it all paints a very complex picture.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. Revisiting the core question, authentic or forgery? What does the evidence, especially viewed through the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggest?
Well, what we have is a lot of circumstantial evidence that aligns the Shapira scroll remarkably well with finds made decades later. The material, the discovery story, the wrapping, the ruling details, the dark look, even some paleographic nuances.
Points that were used to dismiss it in 1883 now look like potential points in favor of authenticity.
Exactly. It strongly suggests the 19th century scholars, lacking that comparative evidence of actual ancient Hebrew leather scrolls, reached logical conclusions based on what they knew, but those conclusions might simply have been wrong. Their assumptions were challenged by Qumran.
And modern scholars have different perspectives now, too.
Yes, people like Allegro, Barquet, Toffs, Sparks. They've studied ancient texts and inscriptions extensively. They highlight that variations and anomalies are actually quite common in genuine ancient texts. So the differences in the Shapira text aren't automatic proof of forgery anymore.
And the scroll itself, is there any hope of it ever turning up again?
Well, it vanished after the scandal, but its path was traced from the bookseller Quaritch to a collector, Dr. Philip Brooks Mason. So it's not impossible, however unlikely, that it still exists somewhere, perhaps misidentified in a collection.
Wow. So this has been a really deep dive into a mystery that just won't quite go away.
It really endures. And while we can't be definitive without the scroll itself, looking back with the knowledge we have now, especially from the Dead Sea Scrolls, it certainly offers a compelling new way to view the whole controversy.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If scholars back in 1883 had been a bit more open-minded, maybe considered that ancient texts could vary, that leather could survive, could they have reached a different conclusion?
That's the big what if, isn't it? Imagine if they had accepted it, or at least preserved it for future study. What might we have learned? It really forces you to think about how our assumptions shape how we see evidence from the past.
A really powerful thought to leave things on. And it's important to remember this reevaluation builds on the work of many scholars over the years.
Absolutely. The article we drew from Honors Professor Menahem Mansour, who was already questioning the forgery verdict way back in 1958, it just shows how important it is to keep revisiting these historical puzzles when new information comes to light.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.